New York City. Upper East Side. A 19th-century residence, once forgotten by time, now transformed into a mansion of dazzling luxury. The new housekeeper, Maria Thompson, 32 years old, was carefully dusting the main hall when her eyes landed on the large portrait hanging above the marble fireplace. A boy, no older than 5, looked out from the canvas with piercing blue eyes that seemed to stare straight into her soul. He was dressed with refined elegance, a navy blue sweater, a spotless white collar, every detail perfect, frozen in paint. Her legs gave out beneath her as a wave of recognition hit her. The feather duster slipped from her trembling hands and fell onto the polished wooden floor with a dry thud that echoed through the silent hall. That face, those unmistakable eyes, it couldn't be possible, and yet it was. James. The boy she had shared 15 years of her life with inside St. Teresa Orphanage, the one who cried every night calling for a mother who never came, the one who had promised her, through tears, that one day they would see each other again. Richard Coleman, the attorney, entered the room after hearing the sharp noise. He stopped in disbelief at the sight before him, his new employee kneeling on the floor before his son's portrait, her face wet with tears, whispering a name he hadn't heard in 27 years. A name only 3 people in the world had ever known, and one of them, his wife Isabella, had been dead for many years, taking her secrets to the grave. What he was about to discover would destroy the foundations of his carefully built perfect life and expose a dreadful truth that a powerful family had buried beneath endless layers of lies, forged documents, and a vast fortune built upon the silence of the innocent. If this story moved you, write in the comments which city you're watching from, and don't forget to press like so you never miss another story. Maria Thompson was 32 and had stopped believing in miracles long ago. St. Teresa Orphanage in Boston had taught her from an early age that life was not a fairy tale with happy endings but a constant struggle to survive. 15 years passed within those cold gray walls, crowded dormitories full of restless children, meals so meager they never filled their stomachs, second-hand clothes passed from one child to another until they fell apart at the seams. Throughout those years, she had watched happy families arrive to choose children, always the youngest, the blonde, the smiling, the ones full of life and laughter. Never her. Never James. He had arrived at the orphanage at only 3 years old, she was 10 at the time. He was a beautiful boy, with eyes so blue they seemed to hold entire oceans, light brown hair always messy no matter how often he tried to comb it, and a rare but heart-stopping smile when it finally appeared on his otherwise serious face. He hardly spoke to anyone. The nuns whispered that he had been found one freezing winter night, abandoned at the iron gate, wrapped carefully in a fine wool blanket embroidered in gold thread with a single name, Michael. Nothing else. No last name, no letter, no clue about who he was or where he had come from. From that first moment, Maria had protected him like a little brother. She patiently taught him how to tie his shoes, gave him half her bread when both were hungry, and wrapped him tightly in her arms during thunderstorms when he cried in fear in the dark. They had become real family, the only true family either of them had ever known in their entire lives. She had called him James, the name embroidered in gold thread on the orphanage blanket. Then, when James was 8 and Maria 18, the unthinkable happened. A rich and elegant couple arrived at the orphanage in a gleaming black car. They wanted to adopt a child. The nuns, anxious and excited, lined up all the children in a row. The woman, dressed in a pearl-colored suit, stared intently at James, and something deep in her eyes changed forever. There was something in the way she looked at him, as if she were seeing someone she had lost long ago. A week later, James left the orphanage and never came back, leaving Maria with a void in her chest that no passing year could fill. She still remembered with absolute clarity their final embrace, those small hands clutching desperately at her worn dress as the nuns led him toward the black car. The whispered promise between sobs that someday, somewhere in the world, they would meet again. She never saw him again after that terrible day. 17 whole years of silence followed, years without a single word, without knowing whether he was alive or dead, happy or suffering. Now Maria lived in New York City, a vast and endlessly noisy capital. She worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in the Upper East Side and other exclusive districts. She had a small, modest apartment in a busy neighborhood, with a window that opened onto a noisy inner courtyard. Every month she paid her bills on time, had enough food on the table, and a roof over her head, more than most of the children from her orphanage days had ever managed to achieve. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a little girl, but it was an honest and dignified life. That cool October morning marked the beginning of her new job. She was nervous but hopeful. The Coleman residence, Upper East Side, one of the most prestigious and desired addresses in all of New York City. The respected attorney Richard Coleman was looking for trustworthy household staff for his mansion. The monthly pay was very good, better than any position she had ever had, and the house itself was magnificent, as if taken straight from the pages of an architecture magazine. Mrs. Margaret, the experienced head housekeeper who managed all domestic affairs with a firm but fair hand, quickly gave her a tour of the main rooms. Marble everywhere, on floors and walls, crystal chandeliers hanging from high ceilings, 6 large bedrooms decorated with refined taste, a library filled with old leather-bound books, a private study, and an enormous main hall. It was in that very hall that she was working that morning when she saw it, and her entire world stopped. She was gently dusting the carved wooden furniture when she lifted her eyes toward the towering white marble fireplace. Hanging above it, in an elaborate golden frame, was an oil painting of a young boy, around 5 years old, dressed elegantly in a navy blue sweater and a spotless white collar, his light brown hair neatly combed to one side, and those eyes, those deep blue eyes that struck her like lightning, eyes that no one could ever forget. Time stopped completely. The world stopped spinning. The duster slipped again from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Maria took unsteady steps forward, almost hypnotized, until she stood directly beneath the portrait, her neck stretched upward, staring at that familiar face, the same face she had once held close when he cried from nightmares. He looked younger in the portrait, only 5, but it was him, there was no question, no doubt. Every detail of his face, every soft curve, the delicate shape of the nose, the gentle line of his lips, and those deep blue eyes she had seen filled with tears so many nights in the darkness of the orphanage dormitory. Her legs gave out completely beneath her. She found herself on her knees on the cold marble floor, unable to remember the exact moment she had fallen. Tears streamed uncontrollably down her cheeks as she whispered, her voice breaking, the name she hadn't spoken aloud in 17 long years of absence. Michael. It was at that precise moment of vulnerability that she heard fast, firm footsteps approaching down the hallway. Richard Coleman, the attorney, entered the hall almost running, alarmed by the sound, and stopped abruptly when he saw her kneeling on the floor. He appeared to be about 35 years old, impeccably dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit. His light brown hair showed a few premature streaks of gray at the temples. His face was defined by sharp, aristocratic features, and his eyes, those same intense blue eyes that shone from the portrait above the fireplace, looked at her with bewildered surprise. Richard stood still for several seconds, trying to understand what he was seeing. His new employee, the woman he had just hired that very morning, was on her knees before his late son's portrait, her face completely covered in tears, whispering something between sobs. A wave of confusion and pain hit him all at once. Something in his chest tightened so violently that he could hardly breathe, as if an invisible hand had gripped his heart. What on earth was happening here? Why was this stranger crying in such anguish before that picture? Maria lifted her eyes, red and swollen from crying, and looked at him. Then her gaze returned to the child's portrait above the marble fireplace, then back to him again, making a connection that left her trembling. The resemblance between father and son was undeniable, too perfect, too precise, impossible to overlook. She tried to speak, to form coherent words, but her throat closed as if strangled by emotion. When she finally managed to find her voice, she whispered, trembling, that forbidden name, James, with such depth of pain and genuine recognition that Richard felt his blood run cold. How could this woman, a complete stranger, possibly know that name, the secret name, the real name of his son, the one embroidered in golden thread on the soft cashmere blanket in which the infant had been found abandoned so many years ago? That name was known only to him and his late wife, Isabella, because when they had adopted the boy, they had changed everything, every trace of his past, every document, every mark of who he once was. They had erased it all, giving him a new beginning and a new life. Richard knelt slowly beside Maria, his movements cautious and heavy, like a man afraid of breaking the fragile line between what was real and what was impossible. And then Maria, still shaking, began to speak, haltingly at first, through sobs, telling a story from the past that would turn his world upside down, destroy every certainty he had ever known, and strip bare the carefully constructed illusion of his perfect life. Richard listened in total silence, without interrupting a single word, his hands gripping his knees tightly as Maria spoke in a trembling voice. She told him about St. Teresa Orphanage in Boston, about the little boy named James, who had arrived at the orphanage when he was only 3 years old, about the 15 long years they had spent together within those gray walls, about how she had protected him from everything and everyone like a devoted older sister. She spoke of the sudden adoption that took him away when he turned 8, of the childish promise they had made to meet again one day in the future, and of the 17 endless years of silence that had followed, during which she had heard nothing of him, not a single word, not a single trace. As Maria spoke, tears spilling down her face, Richard felt as if the entire world were spinning violently around him. Everything he had believed for years began to crumble. His son had died exactly 3 years earlier, drowned tragically in the deep waters of the lake near their family villa at Lake Tahoe. He had been only 8 when that terrible tragedy struck. He and Isabella had been shattered by the unbearable pain of that loss. She had died a year later, people said, from a literally broken heart. Now he lived entirely alone in this enormous, silent house, surrounded only by memories and portraits that watched him from every wall. The echo of his child's laughter had long been replaced by the silence of guilt and grief. But now this woman, this stranger, was claiming something that defied every truth he knew. She was saying, with absolute conviction, that his son had lived at an orphanage until the age of 8. That was impossible. It contradicted every official record. He and Isabella had adopted their baby when he was only a few months old. They had every official document, signed, sealed, legal, proving it. Maria noticed the shadow of doubt flicker in his blue eyes. Gently, yet firmly, she asked to see the adoption documents. Still deeply confused, his thoughts spinning, Richard could not bring himself to refuse her request. Something in her voice, in the steadiness of her gaze, made him obey without understanding why. He led her down the corridor to his private study. With trembling hands, he opened the oak drawer where he kept all the family's important papers neatly organized in folders. Inside were the official birth certificate, the notarized adoption documents, and the death certificate, the one that still made his heart ache every time his eyes fell upon it. Slowly, deliberately, he laid them all out on the polished mahogany desk. Maria examined the papers with painstaking attention. Her eyes moved across every word, every signature, every official seal. The certificate stated that the boy had been adopted from St. Catherine's Orphanage in New York City at the age of 6 months. But she knew with absolute certainty, deep in her heart, that James had lived at St. Teresa Orphanage in Boston until he was exactly 8 years old. The dates didn't match. The locations didn't match. The names of the institutions didn't match. Nothing in those papers matched the truth she had lived. Her voice was quiet but firm when she finally spoke. Something was not right. Those official documents were wrong, or someone powerful had deliberately falsified them. Richard stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backward, hitting the floor with a loud crash. His face flushed with instant anger. "How dare you?" he said in a low, shaking voice. "Who do you think you are to question legal records, to accuse us of something like this?" But even as his outrage spilled into the air, a cold realization began to creep up inside him. The question he had avoided for years suddenly took shape. How could this woman know the name Michael? How could she possibly know that one, intimate detail, the name that no one else, not even his in-laws, had ever known? The name embroidered in gold thread on that baby blanket. Maria stayed perfectly calm in the face of his anger. She didn't move, didn't flinch. When she spoke again, her tone was serene, almost gentle. She told him she wasn't accusing him or Isabella of any wrongdoing. She understood their pain. But somewhere in this story, someone had lied, deliberately and cruelly. Someone powerful had hidden the truth about the boy's real origin. And she needed, desperately, to know who it was and why. She needed to know what had really happened to Michael. Richard sank heavily back into his leather chair, suddenly exhausted, his energy drained away as though every nerve had been pulled from his body. With quiet determination, Maria suggested returning to St. Teresa Orphanage in Boston, to go through the old records and speak with the nuns who might still be alive, especially Mother Teresa, if she was still living. They had to uncover what had really happened when James had been given up for adoption all those years ago. Richard stared at the documents scattered across the mahogany desk, then at Maria's face, steady, sincere, filled with conviction. And something deep within him, something that had been buried alongside his son in the family crypt, stirred suddenly to life again. It was the desperate need to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. His voice was rough, almost broken, when he finally spoke. "We'll leave tomorrow morning," he said. "At dawn. For Boston." That endless night, Richard couldn't sleep for even a single minute. He remained seated, completely alone in the dark living room, staring fixedly at the portrait illuminated by the moonlight that streamed through the tall windows. The silver glow touched the boy's painted face, those eyes, frozen forever in time, and brought back memories he had spent years trying to bury. He remembered, with painful clarity, the day of the adoption so many years ago, the day that had changed their lives forever. Isabella had been immensely happy that day. They had spent years, long, exhausting years, trying to have a child of their own, moving from one specialist to another, seeking out the best doctors in New York City, submitting to endless tests, painful procedures, and costly treatments. The adoption had finally been the only real path left to them, the last chance to create the family they so desperately longed for with all their hearts. It had been Isabella's father, Mr. Edward Collins, the powerful and influential industrial magnate who owned a vast corporate conglomerate with businesses all across the country, who had arranged every step of the process from the very beginning. He had connections in every sphere of power, in government offices, in the highest institutions, and had assured them confidently that he could speed up a process that normally took years. And indeed, in just 3 short months, almost like an unexpected miracle, they had held in their trembling arms the beautiful baby they had dreamed of for so long. At the time, Richard had not asked any uncomfortable questions. In that moment of overwhelming happiness, he had been too grateful to his father-in-law, too overjoyed with his new family to question anything at all. But now, sitting in the dim light of his study, that same gratitude had turned into unease. He began to wonder, what exactly had his powerful father-in-law done to move things along so quickly? Which connections had he called in? What favors had he demanded or repaid? What papers had been signed, and at what cost? And if everything had been legitimate, why were there so many glaring inconsistencies? Why did nothing fit together anymore? The trip to Boston was tense and silent. Maria stared out the car window at the passing landscape, the familiar streets, the buildings from her childhood, the painful memories of the orphanage flooding back like waves crashing against her chest. Richard, seated beside her, kept flipping through the documents he had brought in his briefcase, searching desperately for answers on pages that now seemed to raise more questions than they solved. St. Teresa Orphanage stood on the outskirts of the city, in a quiet area. It was an old gray stone building with a severe, austere architecture, a place Maria remembered all too well, every window, every stair. A young nun in a white habit opened the heavy iron gate, visibly surprised to see visitors. Maria, her voice trembling, asked if Mother Teresa still worked there after all those years. By a stroke of luck, she did. Mother Teresa was still in charge of the orphanage, older now, her back bent under the weight of the years, walking with a wooden cane, yet her eyes remained sharp and penetrating. The moment she saw Maria, she recognized her without hesitation and embraced her warmly with genuine maternal affection. Then she noticed the elegant man who accompanied her, his tailored suit, his composed posture, and the air of quiet authority that surrounded him. Maria, her voice breaking, explained why they had come. It was about James, the blue-eyed boy adopted 17 years earlier when he was 8. They needed to see the official records. Mother Teresa frowned deeply, hesitating. The archives were confidential, strictly private. But Maria pleaded with tears in her eyes, this was desperately important, more important than she could possibly explain in words. For a long moment, the older woman studied them both in silence, her wise gaze moving between their faces. Then she sighed deeply, as though making a difficult decision, and motioned for them to follow her. In silence, they climbed the narrow staircase to a small administrative office on the 2nd floor. From an old wooden cabinet, Mother Teresa pulled several thick, dusty record books, their covers worn and their pages yellowed with time. She turned them carefully, one fragile sheet after another, searching for the year of the adoption. And then, written in careful black ink and elegant handwriting, they found it: Michael, age 8, officially adopted by the Coleman family of the Upper East Side. Documentation provided by Mr. Morgan of New York City. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. That name, Mr. Morgan, it echoed in his mind like a curse. He knew it well. The man had been his father-in-law's right-hand attorney for more than 30 years, the one who had handled all the delicate family affairs, the shadowy business deals no one ever spoke of. He had died 5 years earlier, shortly after Isabella, conveniently, perhaps too conveniently. Mother Teresa continued reading aloud in her trembling voice. There were administrative notes attached to the file. The boy had been declared legally adoptable by the authorities. The Coleman couple had provided all the necessary documentation. Everything seemed perfectly in order, all the seals intact, except for one small handwritten note in blue ink, almost illegible, scribbled in the margin. It read, "Urgent request, documentation expedited by direct superior order. Additional payment received and confirmed." Additional payment. Those two words thundered in Richard's mind like church bells. He closed his eyes tightly, nausea rising in his throat. His father-in-law had bought his son. Literally bought him, as if he were an object, not a child. It had never been a legal adoption. It had been a hidden transaction, a business deal, a sale disguised in paperwork. They had likely falsified the documents to make the boy appear younger, to hide the years he had spent at the orphanage, to erase every trace of his past, his true identity. Maria saw the anguish reflected on his face and placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent gesture of comfort. None of this had been his fault. He had known nothing. He, too, had been a victim. But now they finally knew the truth, however painful it was. James, the boy who would later be renamed Michael, had been torn violently from the only real life he had known and given to a family who, though they had truly loved him, had unknowingly received him through lies, forged papers, and dirty money. Richard turned to Mother Teresa with sudden urgency. There was one more question that burned in his mind, one that terrified him but demanded an answer. He asked, his voice trembling, whether the orphanage had any record of a child named James listed in their death certificates from 3 years earlier. Mother Teresa carefully checked the most recent records, turning the pages slowly with practiced care. No, there was no death certificate, no official report of any child by that name dying. If the boy had truly died, the orphanage would have been informed immediately, because James was still, technically, under their legal jurisdiction. The adoption had never been fully finalized in the official records. Richard rose so suddenly that the wooden chair fell backward with a loud crash. His breath caught in his throat. What could that possibly mean? His son had died 3 years ago. He had personally seen the body at the hospital. He had arranged every detail of the funeral. He had buried his only child in the family crypt. There existed an official death certificate, signed and stamped by the authorities. And yet, the evidence before him told a different story. He nearly ran out of the office, pulling out his phone with trembling hands. He called his assistant in New York City, his voice sharp and urgent. He ordered her to locate, without delay, the original death certificate of his son from the archives of New York General Hospital. He needed to personally verify every detail, the signatures, the stamps, the official wording. The assistant called back exactly 2 hours later, while Richard and Maria sat in silence at Café Hope near the orphanage, too shocked and emotionally drained to speak to each other. Her voice trembled noticeably on the other end of the line. The certificate existed in the archives, but there were serious irregularities. The signature of the coroner was genuine and verified, but the child's body had never been officially identified through fingerprints or DNA testing, as required by law. The identification had been made only visually by the grieving parents, and the funeral had been held as a private ceremony with a closed casket, no public viewing, at the explicit request of the Coleman family. Richard dropped the phone onto the wooden cafe table, staring at Maria, his eyes wide, his face pale as marble. What if Michael had never died at all? What if the entire tragedy had been an elaborate lie, a monstrous conspiracy? They returned to New York City that very afternoon in complete silence, 1,000 questions racing through their minds. If Michael hadn't truly died, then where was he now? Why would anyone make an entire family believe their child was dead? Who stood to gain so much from such a cruel deception? Richard's thoughts immediately turned to his father-in-law, Mr. Edward Collins. The man had died 7 years earlier, not long after the supposed death of the boy. He had left behind an enormous corporate conglomerate, worth billions of dollars in assets and properties, and had left everything to Isabella, his only daughter. When she died of grief a year later, the entire financial empire passed directly to Richard, as her widower. But if the child had still been alive, the direct blood heir, the inheritance laws would have dictated that he, not Richard, would inherit the full fortune upon reaching adulthood. Richard would have been merely a temporary guardian of the estate. What if someone powerful hadn't wanted that money to go to the rightful heir? What if someone close to the family had deliberately removed the child to secure the inheritance? Who would have benefited the most from the boy's death? And who had been close enough to orchestrate such an elaborate and dangerous deception without arousing suspicion? Richard immediately called his trusted private investigator, a discreet man who had worked for him for years, and urgently instructed him to investigate every person connected to the Collins family from 3 years ago. Financial transactions, phone records, international travel, offshore transfers, everything had to be examined in detail. And in particular, he told him to focus on Robert Collins, his brother-in-law, Isabella's younger brother. Robert. He hadn't thought of him as a suspect at first. After all, Robert had always been the quiet one, insignificant within the family. The second son who had never inherited anything from his father, who had lived modestly on a small monthly allowance, always overshadowed by his successful sister Isabella. But now Richard began to recall how strangely helpful Robert had been after the tragedy, how efficiently he had arranged every detail of the funeral, how he had personally handled the legal paperwork, how he had comforted Isabella and stayed by her side constantly, too constantly, as if refusing to leave the house for even a moment. 2 days later, the private investigator called back. His voice was tense. He had found something deeply disturbing. 3 years earlier, exactly 1 week after the boy's officially declared death, Robert Collins had received a wire transfer of $3 million from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The original source of the funds was impossible to trace completely because of banking secrecy laws, but the intermediary bank matched one that Mr. Edward Collins had used for decades for his private dealings. And there was more. 3 weeks after the supposed death of the child, Robert had purchased, in cash, an expensive property in Switzerland, a luxurious, isolated villa near the beautiful shores of Lake Zurich. He had bought it through a shell company registered in Liechtenstein, but the investigator had successfully traced the documents back to him. And who, according to the Swiss municipal records, lived in that villa? A boy, about 9 years old, legally registered as the adopted son of Robert Collins, under the new name Michael Collins, the same child once known as James. Richard dropped the crystal glass he was holding. It shattered across the marble floor into 1,000 pieces, but he didn't even notice. He stood frozen, paralyzed, unable to breathe. Maria was beside him, reading the investigator's report, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Michael was alive. His son was alive. But he was a prisoner, held by the uncle who had faked his death in order to steal his inheritance. Richard shot up from his chair. They had to travel to Switzerland immediately, not a minute to waste. But Maria grabbed his arm firmly and stopped him. If they went there without a plan, Robert could disappear with Michael in a matter of hours. He could flee the country. He could even harm the boy to destroy the evidence. They had to think carefully, plan every step, and contact the right authorities before taking action. Richard knew she was right. Rationally, he understood it. But every fiber of his being screamed to run, to board the next flight and find his son, to hold him, to bring him home. That night, while Maria packed and prepared for the coming days, her thoughts returned to the children she had left behind at St. Teresa Orphanage. Some had been forgotten forever, others, maybe, had found their way back to life. She realized that life often separates people only to give them a second chance, and she made a silent vow that she would do everything in her power to bring Michael back home. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in his study, haunted by memory. For 3 endless years he had wept over an empty grave while his son was alive somewhere across the ocean, frightened, confused, perhaps wondering every day why his father hadn't come for him, why he had been abandoned. Maria promised solemnly that they would bring the boy home safely, but that they had to be cautious with every single move they made. Both of them knew that facing Robert meant risking everything. Robert Collins was an extremely dangerous man, unscrupulous, intelligent, and ruthless. He had already proven himself capable of kidnapping a child and falsifying an official death certificate. They needed solid, irrefutable proof before approaching the US or Swiss authorities, or Interpol USA and Switzerland. They urgently needed someone they could trust completely, someone who could travel personally to Switzerland, see the boy with their own eyes, and discover exactly what was happening inside that isolated villa. Richard said immediately that he would send the professional private investigator he had already hired, but Maria shook her head firmly, refusing outright. A professional investigator using traditional methods would be noticed immediately in a small, quiet Swiss village where everyone knew one another. They needed someone who could pass completely unnoticed among the locals, someone Robert had never seen or heard of. She said she would go herself. She could easily present herself as an American tourist on vacation, rent a modest little house near the villa, quietly observe the daily routine, and wait patiently for the right opportunity without drawing attention. And when that moment finally came, she would speak directly to Michael, remind him who she truly was, and tell him that they were coming soon to rescue him. Richard wanted to protest. It was far too dangerous for her to confront Robert alone, but Maria gave him a sad, quiet smile. James had been her brother in spirit for 15 years at St. Teresa Orphanage, long before he became Richard's adopted son. She had protected him faithfully when he was small and helpless. Now it was time to protect him again, to finally keep that childhood promise. Maria left for Switzerland exactly 3 days later, her determination unwavering. Richard had given her enough cash, perfectly prepared travel documents, and everything she could possibly need for her dangerous mission, including a special encrypted phone for secure communication that could not be intercepted. The small town near Lake Zurich was picturesque and serene, like something out of a postcard. Maria rented a modest house a few hundred meters away from Robert's property, close enough to watch without raising suspicion. The villa was large and luxurious, surrounded by a tall stone wall with modern electric gates and security cameras. From certain angles in the nearby forest, she could see parts of the vast garden. Sometimes, with patience and luck, she saw a lonely boy playing among the trees. Her heart shattered the first time she saw him in the sunlight. It was Michael, without a doubt, taller now, older, almost 11. But those deep blue eyes were unmistakable. He was thin, far too thin for his age, and moved slowly, as though constantly tired or ill. There was something in those young eyes that broke her completely, a deep sadness that should never exist in a child. Maria spent entire days carefully observing the household's strict routine. Robert left the villa every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, driving his black car toward the nearby city, and returned late, never before 10 at night. An elderly woman worked as the housekeeper and cared for Michael during the day. She seemed kind in her gestures but maintained a cold professional distance from the boy. On the 4th day of surveillance, Maria finally saw the opportunity she had been waiting for. The elderly woman took the bus to the village market, leaving Michael completely alone in the garden for about 30 minutes. Maria waited patiently for 5 minutes to make sure, then approached the stone wall quietly. She called softly, using his true name. James. The boy turned sharply toward the sound, looking around in confusion. Maria called again, a little louder this time. James approached the tall wall cautiously, his head tilted upward, trying to locate the mysterious voice. Maria stepped into a spot where he could see her clearly through the decorative iron bars of the gate. Her voice trembled as she asked if he remembered her somehow. Maria from St. Teresa Orphanage, the one who had shared her bread with him when there wasn't enough to eat, the one who had held him close during thunderstorms when he cried in fear. Michael stared at her for a long, silent moment, processing what he heard. Then something deep in his blue eyes shifted, recognition, memory, a flicker of an old bond resurfacing after years of darkness. He whispered her name, disbelieving. Maria. Hot tears streamed down her cheeks uncontrollably. Her voice broke as she told him that she had come from far away, from America, to bring him home, to his real home, to his real father, who loved him desperately and had searched for him day and night for 3 endless years. But Michael shook his head sadly, fear spreading across his face. He couldn't escape. His uncle Robert told him constantly that his father, Richard, had died tragically in the same accident as his mother, Isabella, that he was the only family left, the only one who cared for him now. And if he ever tried to run away or talk to anyone, terrible things would happen. He threatened him subtly, every single day. Rage rose inside Maria like fire, but she remained outwardly calm, not wanting to frighten the boy. She told him softly, yet with firm conviction, that Robert had been lying to him all this time. His father was alive, completely alive, and loved him more than words could express. He had cried without end for 3 long years, believing his son dead and buried. Michael looked terrified and confused, struggling to understand everything he was hearing. Maria spoke gently, her voice full of compassion. She told him she understood his fear perfectly. He must not try to escape on his own, it was too dangerous. But he had to believe that she would return soon with his true father and that together they would take him away legally, safely, with full police protection. Michael hesitated for a few long seconds that felt like eternity, then slowly nodded. For the first time in years, hope flickered in his eyes. Then, suddenly, they both heard the low rumble of a car approaching on the driveway. Robert had returned early, unexpectedly. Michael quickly backed away from the wall and began playing with a ball, pretending nothing had happened. Maria slipped behind the thick trees, her heart pounding violently in her chest. That night, she called Richard from her encrypted phone and told him everything in detail. Michael was there, in the villa. He was alive and physically unharmed, but terrified and psychologically broken after years of manipulation and lies. They needed to act quickly but with extreme caution to avoid putting him in danger. Richard said he was already working closely with Interpol USA and Switzerland. He had all the documentary evidence, the suspicious $3 million transfers, the falsified adoption and death certificates. The authorities were carefully preparing an international arrest warrant for Robert Collins on charges of child abduction, but it would take a few more days to coordinate the legal process between the United States and Switzerland due to international treaties. Maria said with determination that she would stay in the village and continue watching Michael closely. Richard told her, with genuine concern, to be extremely careful. Robert was unpredictable. Then he said something he had never told anyone except his late wife, Isabella. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for loving my son all those years when I didn't even know he existed, when he was still James in that orphanage. Thank you for never forgetting him. Thank you for bringing him home." The coordinated police operation took place exactly 1 week later. Swiss authorities, working jointly with U.S. law enforcement and Interpol USA and Switzerland, arrived at the isolated villa at 6 in the morning, their sirens silent. Maria was there as a witness, standing beside a visibly tense Richard, the private investigator, several attorneys, and social workers ready to care for the child. Robert Collins was arrested as he tried to flee through the back gate with a suitcase full of cash and incriminating documents. The Swiss dawn was cold and silent. Outside, a blanket of fog covered the villa's garden as the police moved quietly through the property. He screamed his innocence as they handcuffed him. They found Michael Collins in his second-floor bedroom, sitting alone on the bed, eyes wide open. He looked frightened and confused by the sudden burst of strangers in uniforms. Then his blue eyes found Richard, standing in the doorway. He studied his face for a long, trembling moment, and then, finally, whispered that single, sacred word. "Dad." Richard crossed the room in 2 steps, knelt before his recovered son, and cupped the boy's face in his shaking hands. With a broken voice, he told him yes, he was his father. He said he was so sorry for not being there to protect him, for not knowing the truth. But now he was here, and he would never let him go again. He pulled him into his arms, holding him tightly as both of them wept uncontrollably. Michael threw himself into his father's embrace, sobbing freely at last, as years of pain and confusion dissolved into tears. Richard Coleman held him close, crying as well, whispering that this time he would never lose him again. Mrs. Maria stood at the doorway, tears in her eyes but a calm smile on her face. Michael was finally home. Several days passed before peace slowly returned. The following months were difficult. Robert Collins was charged with kidnapping, forgery, and fraud. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Throughout the trial, he never showed an ounce of remorse. His arrogant words only confirmed his guilt before everyone. The media called it the scandal of the century, and his name became synonymous with greed and betrayal. When the judge read the verdict, Richard felt that the truth had finally come to light, though nothing could erase the pain. The stolen assets were recovered. The case caused a national uproar, involving one of the most powerful families in the country. But for Richard and Michael, the only thing that truly mattered was rebuilding their lives. Michael needed therapy to understand everything that had happened. He needed time to remember who he truly was, to accept that his father loved him, and to believe that he was now safe. And Richard, grateful beyond words to Maria for everything she had done, offered her much more than a job as a housekeeper. He offered her a place in his family, a room in the Coleman residence, and a role as part of their home. She had been James's sister when no one else was. She had been the one who brought him back home. She deserved to be part of their lives. Maria accepted. For the first time in her life, she had a real family. 2 years later, Richard, Michael, and Maria sat together in the main hall of the Coleman residence. Above the fireplace, beside the old portrait of Michael as a child, now hung a new one, Michael, 13 years old, smiling and happy, with Richard on one side and Maria on the other. A family rebuilt from broken pieces, but strong, honest, and whole again. Michael went to school, had friends, and laughed again. Sometimes he still had nightmares, but every morning he woke up in a place where he felt loved, where he knew he was safe, and that made all the difference. Richard had learned that family is not defined by blood or legal papers, but by love, protection, and presence. It was Maria, who had never forgotten. It was Michael, who had survived and forgiven. And it was himself, who had finally found the courage to face the truth. And Maria, looking at the two men she loved most in her life, knew she was finally home. Not in an orphanage, not in a small rented room, but in a real home. A home where, when you say family, everyone turns toward you. Where, when you say, I love you, someone always answers. Where, when you look at a portrait on the wall, you no longer see a lost child, but one who was found. If you believe in the power of memory and in love that survives the years, hit like. Comment if you, too, believe that true family isn't the one written in blood, but the one written in the heart. Share this story to remind others that it's never too late to bring home the one you love. Subscribe for more stories proving that justice may take time, but it always arrives. Sometimes life separates us from the people we love most. Sometimes we believe we've lost them forever. But there are moments when destiny, or perhaps the stubborn love of someone who never stops searching, brings everything back where it belongs. Maria never forgot James. Richard never stopped loving his son, even when he thought he was gone. And Michael kept waiting, even when hope seemed lost. That is the strength of a real family. Not the one written on paper or decided by judges, but the one written in the hearts of those who refuse to give up, to forget, or to stop loving. And when they finally reunite, when all the pieces fall back into place, there is no portrait big enough to hold all that happiness.